Darker is a fantasy RPG extraction game that has some of the best gameplay and design I've ever played in a game, with some of the worst publishing practices I've ever personally witnessed. It is a free-to-play niche title with delightfully difficult combat, actual choices in the character you make and how you play them, and some of the most impressive tiny details I've ever had the pleasure of experiencing. It's a game that I think anyone interested in games should play, but not one that I think they should buy. And it's somewhat paradoxical to say that, but that's how I feel. If you have a computer that can run this game, it is worth trying it to see if this style of gameplay would appeal to you. And I don't mean the extraction side, but rather the combat and almost immersive sim level of interactions you can have with it. And it's also a good metric to see if this level of quality in the game is worth dealing with the most ridiculous monetization practices I've seen in a while. But before we get to that, let's talk about the many things that this game does right. I've read some criticism that this game is too unforgiving and reliant on trial and error rather than explaining anything to you. The source of this criticism comes from the Steam reviews I've read, which is to be expected when a game is free for anyone to download and review. It's perhaps a symptom of having a lower bar of entry, and maybe that's something to hold against Steam rather than the game itself. Much like a lot of new players, I knew very little about this game before getting into it. I knew it was fantasy, I saw it had mixed reviews on Steam when I looked at it, and I knew one other thing from reading reviews that I'll reveal later. I didn't play the game before it went free to play, and that leads me to having to explain something that's going to come up later as well. I'm not even remotely close to being an expert at this game. I haven't mastered every class or every dungeon. I've extracted out of each of them, but I am nowhere close to the level that some people will come to expect of someone taking the time to review/critique the game. I don't feel comfortable explaining meta strategies and min-maxing equipment and stat calculations because that's not what I focused on in my time with this game. Somebody who knows the numbers will talk about them, and if that's what you're looking for, I implore you to find it elsewhere, because this will not be about that. My first time playing this game was thankfully captured live via a live stream I did on June 11th, which will also explain the garish bar in the top right corner from that footage. I looked through each of the 9 classes, chose Bard because I thought it'd be funny, and launched the game without knowing anything more than that. I didn't know how to equip my weapons, how combat worked. I opened a door and got killed by a goblin with a bolus immediately. The next round I learned how to equip items, somewhat, learned that there's some amount of directional combat via a bleeding skeleton, then got killed by another skeleton shortly after. On my third round, I killed a zombie, continued to learn how to play instruments, spent an exorbitant amount of time killing spiders through this tiny gap in the struts, properly learned how to use my equipments and rest, then died via this Viking-esque skeleton. It was after that third round that I finally looked in the menus for some explanations of mechanics and started to make my bard into someone much more suited to my playstyle, adjusting within the parameters set before delving once again. On the final round of that stream, I explored a good portion of the chasm before succumbing to the time limit rather than any monster. I learned how to use my full arsenal and demonstrated my knowledge time and time again to maximize my equipment and had a genuinely fun time despite not knowing my end objective. 4 rounds into this game and I still didn't know that it was an extraction type game. It might have been the single greatest leap in competency that I experienced while playing this game. It's not crucial for you to listen to this experience in as much detail as I am to understand this game, but it is important to me that you have a grasp of my experience with it. This was the first time that I experienced what so many people did with Dark Souls and its sequels, where that difficulty that was overbearing at first became easier to grasp and learn. Many people talk about the ideal way to play the Soulsborne games, usually involving avoiding all outside knowledge and learning for yourself rather than following any sort of guide. It was after this that I sleuthed around off-stream and inspected the game closer, which is when I discovered that this game was an extraction-style game. Extraction games are often categorized as PvPvE, where players and AI opponents are equally as dangerous, and you're meant to loot for better items and valuables before extracting from the play area. The most popular ones that people will be familiar with are Tarkov, Hunt Showdown, and Modern Warfare's DMZ Warzone. I haven't played the first 2, but I played enough of DMZ to understand how enthralling these games can be to that particular audience. For me, I enjoy playing these games more from the PvE side, fighting different types of enemies and looting areas for gear. PvP isn't my strong suit, since in most games like it, I find that I'm too casual for the hardcore crowd that these games often attract. What attracted me to this game is the depth of options you have while playing it, and how it has an immersive sim level of quality, meaning that the barrier between game and reality is far lower in this game than most others. Before we get to the finer details, let's start around properly. Once you click launch, you'll be placed into either a tavern or a cave, which is a waiting area for people to join, but are both very visually striking. The cave matches the aesthetics of the goblin area perfectly, and the tavern/castle is downright striking. There's even some potentially dynamic elements with these wanted posters, though I can't personally confirm that. You'll arrive with only your bare hands and this menu and HUD to quickly uncover, lest you get attacked by monsters or players. The bottom right is your map. This displays your current location, connecting hallways and rooms, and will show you where the extraction point is or where you can delve deeper. Next to that is your equipment. At first, this menu is somewhat messy, but it comes together quickly in play. Your first and second slots are for weapons, shields, spells, and some larger lanterns. Your third and fourth slots are for utility items, which range from health items like potions and bandages to instruments and even lockpicks and disarming devices. These cycle on a list of 3 per category and are a welcome system as compared to having to use the entire number bar for each item. The bottom middle is your health, abilities, and any status effects you have currently. Your abilities pertain to the type of character you're playing and the abilities you have equipped. For my bard, my 2 abilities were songs and an ability that I never really used, maybe because the situations presented to me didn't warrant it. For my cleric, however, this was my spells on the right and a holy lightning bolt thing that I also didn't use, also because the situations I was in didn't warrant it. What's the same on every character, though, is the rest option, which is how you'll mostly be regenerating your health after enemy encounters, assuming you don't want to use an item. Bottom left is your character portrait, which also displays your health, but also what your character looks like, which while you can't currently customize the presets, it does react to the armor you're wearing, which I thought was wonderful. Top right is a kill feed, top middle is a compass, and the top left is an icon for the inventory. We'll talk about the UI in a little bit, since I want to lay a foundation for everything going forward right now, but some of you watching might already notice some of the things I'm going to comment on later. In the middle of the screen is a cursor, which is where we'll transition into actual gameplay. There are 9 classes in this game, each with their own unique abilities and starting equipment. For the majority of my playtime, I've used the Bard and the Cleric, 2 classes on opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of difficulty. The Bard is what I started with my man Sir Noisy, who begins with a rapier and instruments, and basically nothing else apart from torches, which all characters begin with. The rapier is a fun but difficult weapon to learn, probably much like real life if I had to guess. It has the ability to thrust and slash, usually as a combo that sees you thrusting, then slashing diagonally, vertically, then horizontally, before returning to a thrust, indicated both in animation and by the cursor changing with each attack. Attacks in this game are slow and admittedly kind of clunky, and require you to adjust the way you play compared to other games, which means I finally get to do what every reviewer and analyst does and compare this game to Dark Souls. Dark Souls is a game that I personally played and completed in early 2023, though my first time ever playing it was back in 2015. Back then I didn't have nearly enough patience to get through Undeadburg, and wasn't nearly skilled enough to beat the Taurus demon. It was difficult, complicated, and not appealing to the young lizard brain that was more fixated with zombies and space marines. Returning in 2023 with a new outlook on games as a whole, and understanding the importance of the series made those painful moments bearable. I learned the game's systems, learned how to build my character more efficiently, and most of all, I learned patience. Patience is also something that you need to have when playing Dark and Darker. Enemies hit hard, your movement is slow, and there's a million things that you have to learn, otherwise you'll get steamrolled. Each time I died on my first playthroughs, I came away learning something, either how equipment works or how to cast a spell, or how resting restores a portion of your health without needing to use an item. It was the closest that I've come to what so many people enjoy about the Souls series, having to learn and experiment and conquer eventually. I loved learning that body parts take different damage, aiming with the shield is necessary to block incoming attacks, and that physically ducking under attacks is possible depending on the enemy you're fighting. Attacks aren't radiating damage out in front of you, it's combined with animations that makes it feel more intuitive than most other games. Dark Souls does this often with enemy attacks being consistent with their animations, but later entries or even later fights within the same game can mess with this to increase the difficulty of certain enemies. For the most part in this game, enemies are consistent in their movements so that a skilled player will be able to dodge many incoming attacks, assuming they have their reaction time and stats like movement speed is high enough to dodge them. Stats are a part of this game, but I haven't found much explanation of it in-game, nor do I think it's all that crucial like it is in RPGs and tabletops. The most I've seen is spell slots for spellcasters being gated off by certain stats, which I believe is able to be upgraded with equipped items. Each item picked up during expeditions has unique stats that are either an improvement or a downgrade of whatever you currently have equipped. Some can increase your stats as well, such as some items increasing health, strength, or even stats pertaining to spell slots, like we mentioned earlier. For one of my characters, I had a ring that increased my knowledge, which allowed me to equip more spells for that character, and when I died with that ring on, that spell became inaccessible since it relied on having those extra slots, which I found confusing at first and then retroactively understood. Not every item can be equipped by every class. Most gloves, boots, and pants can be equipped by everyone, as well as potions and bandages, but more unique items like armor and weapons are class-specific. A bard can't use a spellbook meant for a wizard or a cleric, and a wizard can't swing a great hammer. All classes can pick up instruments, which I find weird, but without a music book it makes them effectively noise machines, which I suppose has its uses since enemies do react to noise. For my bard playthrough, I leveled up the character to around level 20, which took probably the same amount of games to play with a handful of successful extractions. I did a majority of my learning on this character, and then thought it would be pertinent to switch classes in order to properly understand how different the game can be. My next character was a cleric, who came equipped with a strong melee weapon, a spellbook, a shield, and healing potions. The spellbook came with a mix of healing, buff, and damage spells that regenerated upon resting. Technically my bard had these as well, but the clerics were much more powerful, as well as being much clearer in their function. For a while I thought that the healing spell from the bard would heal me each time I casted it, when in reality it made healing while resting faster. Don't get me wrong, I like the bard and it might be one of my favorite classes, but in terms of difficulty, it's no question which one is better suited for a new player. On my bard character, it took me 4 attempts to successfully extract from the Goblin Caves, which is one of the easiest areas in the game. On my first cleric run, I was able to extract on my first run of the character. Game knowledge obviously helped, but the plentiful healing and powerful base equipment were the biggest contributors to that in my opinion. I won't go into specific details for every class, but the simple limiting factor does wonders in making every character feel unique and specialized. Every character seems to fill a different role either in solo play or with other people. A fight between a wizard and a ranger will be different than a ranger and a bard, which is something that even the best and most celebrated games can falter in. To some people, this might be the best thing that the game does. It maintains an immersive perspective while also having the build diversity of a traditional tabletop RPG. But to me, this is all parallel, or maybe even slightly lower in terms of impressiveness when compared to the sheer amount of details that the developers have put into this game. I noticed within the first 20 minutes of playing the game that the animations and hitboxes are so good that certain weapons are able to penetrate through the gaps in walls or cells. Using the thrust attack on my rapier to finesse my blade through wooden beams and into a spider's face felt like I found something that the developers didn't expect, but still allowed because of how much they didn't cut corners with the little stuff. Animations in particular are both frustrating and impressive, since even the slightest angle off will make your attack deflect off of hallways or shields. I don't know if there's any form of parry or riposte, but it wouldn't surprise me with this game. Running out of torches at one point while I was playing a cleric was concerning, at least until I discovered that spells emit light in the area, meaning that I had a free source of light since I could cancel the spell whenever I needed to. As a bard, I was able to tell mimics apart from normal chests by using 2 different spells, one that attacks enemies in a certain radius, and another that unlocks all chests in a certain radius as well. If one of the spells didn't work, the other one would every single time. In one fight, I was shot in the back of the head by a skeletal archer. Rather than ragdoll or do a preset death animation, my limp corpse collided with the doorway, destroying it permanently. I've seen AI opponents both attack and buff each other and react to me playing music or noticing me if I stay within their line of sight. Items that I had equipped were being represented on my person at all times, despite the fact that the game is strictly in first person and you probably wouldn't be able to see most of them. Arrows would often embed themselves either on my person or on my shield, and they would linger for a while whenever I got hit. I can't help but congratulate the developers for putting the time into making all of this one of the most impressive games I've ever been able to play. Everything felt accurate in a way many games don't even try to achieve. And when they do, they often fall short with mismatched hitboxes, animation, and level geometry and decorations. I've been over these areas quite a bit, and I have yet to find something glaringly wrong in that department. This is the part of the game I enjoyed the most. This is the part I wanted to continue interacting with as opposed to the PvP encounters which, while they still have the same qualities as the other combat encounters, were not enjoyable to me individually. That's not a knock against PvP. In fact, PvP in this game feels way better than its contemporaries, like it was an actual priority planned from the beginning and the rest happened to form around it. I'm not saying that's what happened, as I don't know how the development of this game came to be, and it's impossible for me to tell from the end result because every end of this game is refined. I'm convinced that almost anyone could pick this game up and have a completely different experience with it, but whether the lasting impact from said experience is positive or negative would be up to the individual playing. For me, having heard of the wonderful experiences people have had with immersive sims in the past, it was always upsetting that I wasn't able to get past myself in order to enjoy them properly. The closest experience I had was with Arcane's Prey from 2017, and while I enjoyed it enough to recommend everyone play it, I couldn't keep my attention on it well enough to complete it. Again, just like Darker, that's not a knock against the game, that's against me, and I highly recommend this game and its associated DLC content. Project Zomboid, which I also picked up last year, was also like this, and I have experiences that I remember quite fondly from learning the game and the character I had in it. Darker is the best one of these more immersive games that I've personally played, but that's not to say that it's perfect, not by a long shot. There are 3 issues I can currently name with the game, 1 minor, 1 major, and 1 fundamental issue that I genuinely believe will destroy the game if it's not addressed in time. We'll go in order with these, but this first one is by far the smallest of the group. When I say minor, I mean something you might not have even noticed, and I didn't notice until several games in. The UI is an absolute mess. The tab button in the top left corner is the best place to start, since it's completely useless to be a permanent fixture on the screen, especially in its current place. It might be a thematic addition, since your inventory appears on the left-hand screen, but it's too big and out of place where it is, since the top of the screen has less intrusive HUD elements like a compass and the kill feed. Speaking of the compass though, it's kind of useless in a game in which the minimap tracks your facing location as well as your physical position. These 2 separate things serve the same purpose, so having them both on screen isn't really necessary. It seems that the UI designers couldn't decide on which one was better for the game, and rather than pick one, they chose all of them. This extends to the health and status bars as well. By default, there are 3 different ways to tell how much health you have. This tiny bar off to the side of the portrait, and the portrait itself going red when you take damage. Similarly, both the portrait and bottom bar have 2 sets of icons for status effects, which really does lean into the idea that there were multiple ideas on how to approach the UI in this game, and they implemented it all at once, maybe to test which one players liked more. If that's the case, I prefer the bar idea more than the portrait, and I think a middle placement works best, and centralizing information will most likely be the best option. Ideally, these things would be toggleable so each person could have their own HUD unique to their playstyle and character. Also ideally, the HUD elements could be explained or interactable whenever you receive a status or see something on the map. None of these statuses are explained in-game, neither are the icons on the minimap, and this leads into the more major issue of the game. See, something that I argue every game needs to have is an optional tutorial. Ideally, this tutorial would be well integrated into whatever game you're playing, like the Fire Arena from Apex, most first missions in Call of Duty campaigns, or even simply a document in a game that explains basic information about it. Basic information like, oh, I don't know, how to use spells as a mage, play songs as a bard, or what the rest mechanic does. I enjoy the trial and error method for learning specific interactions in a game and experimentation, but when I am dying over and over again because health and combat were not explained to me and I have to put my player through the meat grinder before understanding that swinging actually matters in the game, isn't fun. Did you know that the Squire can change your starting equipment? I didn't know that. I was never told that. I just happened to click into his merchant menu to see what he sells. Turns out, he doesn't sell anything. He just changes your equipment if you want him to. Did you know that other merchants can do more than buy and sell as well? Some of them can craft for you, others can retrieve items in the dungeon for you, and you can even complete quests for them. Oh yeah, quests. Those are a thing, but fuck you if you think the game is going to explain where these hyper-specific locations are, or will highlight necessary items so you don't throw them away, and if I'm not mistaken, which I don't think I am, you can't see your quest log when you're in a match. Something that fundamental is missing from a game like this. This goes beyond not having a tutorial for the sake of experimentation and self-discovery into not having a tutorial out of spite or stubbornness. Did you know that breaking boxes, vases, or spider dens was possible? Some of you might have been able to make this logical step, and maybe this is just an issue with how I perceive games, but these gorgeously designed models with their unique, individual sound effects did not ring to me as being destructible, just like wooden boards that block some doorways did not ring to me as being destructible either. And maybe that's an effect of this game being free to play while also having the polish of a good AAA studio. And that's where my final issue comes to light, and where I think this game is teetering either on going down as a legend or in flames. You might have noticed in the introduction that I said character instead of characters. And with the diverse amount of characters in the layout of this character select screen, it's highly implied that you'd be able to play as multiple characters and classes. And, on a fundamental level, this is true, but there are two different paths that you can go down that highlight the issue I have with this system. The first is, in one way, the much easier option. Upgrade your account to the Legendary Edition, which gives you the ability to unlock additional systems and mechanics that aren't in the free-to-play version. Initially, this game costed around $35, at least according to this Games Radar article. This was, of course, before the free-to-play model was implemented, and many games that make this shift have caveats as to how this content is gated off. Destiny 2, for example, eventually released much of the base content in the first two expansions for free, and had the annual content releases be additional purchase as a sort of season pass. This system sucks in my opinion, but it is a way to allow the game to extend its lifespan while offering the style of content that players expect from this game. And, usually, the content isn't mandatory to enjoy a fundamental part of the game. Strikes in the Crucible aren't broken because you didn't buy Lightfall. Another game with a similar model, Trackmania, gives you the opportunity to play it for free, but gates a significant portion of its content off with payments, effectively making the free version more akin to a trial or a demo. This is much more troublesome to me, since it makes the free-to-play option kind of superfluous and almost misleading if I can't access 90% of its content. Imagine if Fortnite locked off everything except Battle Royale behind a more expensive version of the Battle Pass, and I think you can understand what I'm getting at. Dark and Darker's Legendary Edition comes with 4 changes to the free version: character slots, high roller dungeons, trading, and a shared inventory between all characters. 2 of these are totally okay to put behind a paywall, and the other 2 piss me off beyond belief and are the 2 reasons I don't recommend you purchase this game yet. When I first downloaded the game on Steam, the only things I knew was that it was fantasy, it was hard, and I skimmed a handful of reviews that each mentioned that the microtransactions are ridiculous in this game. I didn't understand until several hours in just what those reviews were getting at. The legendary upgrade for this game costs 15 redstone, the purchasable currency for this game. A single piece of redstone converts to 2 USD, meaning that this, I want to underline, upgrade, is $30. $5 less than the early access version that came out a year ago. This monetization argument that I'm presenting is something that I believe people are going to be in 2 groups over. The first group being people that find no issue with this and see it as what it ultimately is, a way for the development team to get funding to continue supporting the game. The other group will be arguing that this is overpriced, a blatant attempt to force people to pay for systems that ultimately should have been included with the game to begin with, and at one point probably were. This game feels like it's been hacked in 2 in order to boost profits. It feels like Trackmania more than it does Destiny, which pains me so much because I do genuinely believe this game is better than both. Hell, I think it's better than games that I've paid full price for, but right now it's stained by this mark of greed. In order to play all of the classes in this game and experiment, I had to delete my character every single time in order to use this one slot that I had, meaning that I deleted my level 20 Bard, my level 15 Cleric, and so many others just to experiment. I refuse to pay that amount of money for a game that isn't even out of early access and is a live service game. That's another part of this problem that I don't know if people properly understand is an issue with this price. A live service game is ultimately going to become abandoned and deleted, lost to the annals of history like hundreds of thousands of games before it. And unless there's support added into the future to ensure its survival after the fact, whenever this game runs out of money to keep its servers running, this game will be gone. The money you put into it, the characters you made, it'll all just disappear overnight. It's happened to bigger games, even games that were successful at one point or another. And with this being one platform in one niche genre, its lifespan is increasingly shorter. I don't know how important the price point for this game is. I read very briefly of the publishing and development troubles that this game faced, but I don't know how much this game is required to have this price point. If the game is already running on fumes and these upgrades and microtransactions are the only thing keeping it going, especially with the shift to the free-to-play model, then this issue might already be bigger than I anticipated. But going free-to-play was ultimately a choice. It was a choice to grow the audience for this game and therefore bring in profit to the studio so they can continue to work on it. And it worked. It honestly worked, because I never would have played this game if I had to pay for it to begin with. But I also know that this choice regarding the price point, in its current state, is not bringing in the profit margins that they're hoping for, because everyone I've spoken to about this game hasn't made the jump to upgrading. The other curse of live service titles is the fact that every single argument and point I present right now is also at risk of disappearing and becoming irrelevant, for a multitude of reasons. The developers could change the game so drastically that my points are not in the same realm of relevance. They could address everything or nothing. I'm not a huge fan of talking about games like this because as of June of 2024, this is what the game is like, and depending on when you yourself watch this video, parts of it might not be there at all. But it's also worth making this video because these are the problems that the game has here and now. This is a point on the timeline of this game, especially a live service game, especially an early access game. Much like how anyone can play this game and have a unique experience with it, anyone can also play this game and come away feeling something different. When I come away from this game, I find myself longing for the developers to give me more reasons to come back to it, to make it easier to come back rather than harder. I want them to explain the top layer of gameplay so that learning everything underneath isn't such an uphill battle. I want them to give 2 character slots for free players so I can experiment with new builds without sacrificing everything I've worked so hard for. And I want them to add a mid-tier high roller dungeon so I can gamble my gold before I feel compelled to gamble my real money. I believe that these 2 changes I mentioned would make the Legendary Edition much more appealing to people who are wanting more, as well as a price reduction of $5 to $10. I want to reiterate that I don't know the financial side of this game, so I won't bring up this argument more than this single sentence. 2 character slots is a reasonable amount for someone to have multiple characters to experiment with different playstyles while also being able to unlock more items for said characters. This would also have to be paired with a change to the current delete character system, probably making it so there's a delay before you can create a new character, anywhere from a week to a month. I'd happily take this trade, but I don't know if I'm in the minority for that change. I think 2 being the limit and making the Legendary Edition have slots for all current classes would be a fair balance between free and legendary. So let's get into the other rebalance I'm proposing. High roller dungeons, as they exist now, are the unfiltered experience of the game, with you gambling some of your money, as well as your current resources, for a chance of higher tier loot. You need to wager 100 gold, meaning that you will most likely have had to complete at least 1 extraction. I say most likely because I think you can technically get a quest reward and get loot without extracting, but most people won't know that. If you've played these games before, I'm sure you're familiar with the experience of getting a lot of loot after having a dry spell, nearing an extraction site, only to be killed by a player who's far more familiar with the game than you and is taking advantage of low-level players. That's not your fault inherently, but a fault of the mixture of players that comes with these types of systems. There is usually some type of effort to split the player base into new and experienced player pools, but the current implementation in this game is lackluster. Currently, the only methods of matchmaking is a literal paywall and via equipment value, which is currently set at 25 and is crazy low. Equipment value is determined by the current amount of equipment you have on your person and in your inventory. 25 equipment value is maybe 1 common item on your person, and is too low of a threshold for people who are new to be pitted against people who are experienced. And even without that threshold, I've been paired with people who ambush, snipe, and utilize the full gameplay sandbox to annihilate me. But the reason that the matchmaking is this way is because the free-to-play dungeons have a level cap for loot rarity. At first it was up to, I believe, rare or epic tier loot, at least if my memory serves, and currently it's up to legendary, which means that the high roller dungeons must have higher level loot to acquire since you're unable to bring high tier loot into the normal dungeons. Thing is, this is a one-way solution that free-to-play players aren't able to combat. My working idea to solve this issue is to have 3 tiers that players are able to play. A PvE exclusive zone for casual or new players, a PvP area for all players that requires a wager, and the legendary exclusive area. Tier 1, the PvE, has 3 changes to the current normal formula. No PvP combat, a maximum of rare loot drops, and no delving deeper. This allows people to become more familiar with the game, have a casual/training playthrough area, or to allow higher skilled players a calmer area to assist their friends if they're playing in multiplayer and one of them is just starting out. Tier 2 is largely the same as the current normal mode, but requires that 100 gold wager in order to access. PvP is enabled, you can get up to legendary loot, and it remains a challenging experience with a worthwhile reward that players will want to get, and allow them the ability to delve deeper if they so choose. Tier 3 can largely remain synonymous with the current High Roller dungeons, with no time limit, increasingly difficult fights, and the ability to obtain the highest level of loot. If you wanted to make it more enticing, maybe removing the need to wager money for these dungeons could be a good idea, while also keeping in mind that each tier of loot stays within itself. A player who's able to access Tier 3 can't go into a Tier 1 dungeon with the same level of loot. They would have to reduce it down to at most rare. One criticism you might think of is that this would split the player base too much for any lobby to have players in, but the game already does that with the current implementation of gear rating and the legendary upgrade. This division, at least to me, makes more sense than the arbitrary system while also not feeling like players are being intentionally fed what is essentially a trial version of the game. But that's just my idea, one from a single player's perspective, and I'm sure that there are other ideas out there for the developers to explore if they want to. And I hope that they do, alongside making the legendary upgrade a better offer than it currently is so that people might buy it more to support its ongoing development. Because as much as I might have ragged on certain parts about this game, that's all in reference to what is one of the most impressive games I've ever played. Even though these practices aggravate me and make me wish that they were implemented better, it doesn't mar the astounding gameplay that these developers have put into this game. I want, more than any other game I've played recently, for this game to have a long and fruitful lifespan. I want to see this concept taken further and further, exploring new areas and gaining mastery with each of its mechanics. I want this game to last, and I want to be able to take off the contraction and the parenthesis to this title. I want to be able to say that this game is worth buying, and I believe I will be able to, just not yet.